This video is sponsored by Manta Sleep. Make sure to stay awake so you can learn how to get a good night's rest. One of the questions asked most ubiquitously across world philosophy throughout history has been, what does it mean to be good? So I think I can answer that question given that I make YouTube videos about books about toys.
No, Squidward, I meant good for your soul.
Oh, please. I have no soul.
Hi, I'm Chrono the Harlequin, and today I want to talk to you about the question that's been raging online for quite some time now regarding who is the good guy in Warhammer 40,000. But before I get into it, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, and if possible, consider supporting me on Patreon, as it does really help me out. And consider joining my Discord server, which is linked down below to keep up with me and all the things I'm working on. But without any further ado, let's get into who is the good guy in Warhammer 40,000? And this question is both a lot more simple and a lot more complicated than many people make it out to be. One thing though I would like to address is that most of the discussion surrounding who the good guys are is never good faith intellectual discussion and is oftentimes, well, most of the time, just really bad faith arguing where people already have a position or have an outside political position they want to argue, and are using 40k as a proxy. Trying to buck that trend, though, I want to come at this from a place of genuine consideration and thought, really puzzling on it. So, before we dive into who the good guys are, we need to first consider who is objectively not a good guy. And some of the most easily definable examples of not good guys are the forces of chaos, such as demons and chaos space marines, and a lot of higher level cultists, the Drukhari or Dark Eldar, the Tyranids, the Orcs, and the Necrons. I will say though, the Necrons being evil is generally speaking a newer development given that they have spent the last several million years asleep, which tells me that they would appreciate the sponsor of today's video, Manta Sleep. Let me ask you a question. Are you tired? Well, not of anything in specific, just tired in general. There's a lot going on these days. And want to be able to take a nap even with the bright summer sun and longer days disrupting your circadian rhythms? Well, Manta Sleep can help with that. You thought the Necrons had great sleep technology? Well, you ain't seen nothing yet, because Manta Sleep's high-quality masks are very comfortable and very breathable, and their newest model even has Bluetooth compatibility. So those of you who listen to my videos to help get to sleep, the Manta Sound sleep mask is for you. Or you can try the preferred mask of none other than my mom and try the Manta Pro Sleep Mask, which is light, breathable, durable, and designed for side sleepers. Or if you're a parent with a child who's having trouble getting to sleep, you might want to try the Manta Kids Sleep Mask, specifically designed with your child in mind. And speaking of new parents, it's also wedding season, so a couple Manta Sleep Masks would make excellent gifts for any new couple who are gonna need all the help they can get. So if this offer sounds interesting to you, and if you'd like to help support the channel, consider clicking the link below to go to the Manta Sleep website and use code CHRONO for 10% off your purchase of any Manta Sleep product, because this is one deal you absolutely should be sleeping on. So thank you again to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video, and back to it. Now, you're probably thinking, what do all these quote-unquote evil xenospecies have in common? Well, they're violent, they're needlessly harmful or cruel, and they have no justification for their actions. Well, here's the thing. Let's dissect this one by one. You see, most of the Chaos Space Marines are fully aware that what they are doing is wrong, but they just don't care. They don't believe the rest of the galaxy has the right to tell them what they can and can't do, and most of their actions are driven by bitterness, a desire to strike at those who they believe have wronged them, even to the detriment of the rest of the galaxy. Or in some cases, it's just because they like it. There is no necessity in their actions, or even higher calling or purpose. And even those legions who you could argue do have a higher calling and don't believe they're doing wrong, such as the Death Guard who want to spread the worship of Nurgle, or the Wordbearers who want to spread the worship of chaos in general, it's pretty safe to argue that the rest of the galaxy will argue that they're just deluded, isolated cases. Hell, even many of the traitor Marines view the most faithful among their ranks as just deluded navel-gazers who feel like they're too good to just be cruel for the sake of cruelty and cloak their actions in a veneer of faith. And even if you want to argue, well, they didn't know what they were getting into and are now just stuck in this position, a lot of bad people in real life have similar excuses to that, but it doesn't change the fact that what they do is wrong. And if you want to take it a step further, the demons of chaos are also evil because even though they don't have a choice, it is the very substance of their nature. Their creation is not analogous to a normal race or normal species, because they are created by acts of evil in the warp, and as such are less entities and more sentient acts of evil unto themselves. so as such they cannot be considered good. Now I should note, not all who turn to chaos are evil, many of them are just deluded, such as the soldier who wants to save their comrades and ends up unwittingly giving themselves to Khorne, or the parent who wants to take away their child's pain and unwittingly gives themselves to Nurgle, the scholar or psyker who wants to use their knowledge or abilities to help others and ends up accidentally falling into the hands of Tzeentch, or the artist who wants to exalt the Emperor and all the good things in the universe, but in doing so pushes too far and ends up in the clutches of Slaanesh. These people are not evil, they're just dupes, but they have done something evil by giving themselves to these gods even though they didn't know. Ignorance is a mitigating factor, but it is no excuse. So it's pretty safe to say anything involving chaos is not a good guy. But what about things that don't involve it, such as the Drukhari? Now, on the face of it, you would say, yeah, the Drukhari are evil. They kidnap and torture people and kill them. That's evil. And yeah, you're spot on. That is correct. But it becomes more interesting when you pick it apart and really look at the minutiae. Because the Imperium is capable of some very cruel stuff to people. See servitors. However, they have reasons for doing so. The Drukhari have no such excuse. But wait a minute, you would say, they have to, because if they don't, Slaanesh will slowly leech away their souls and then eventually drag them into a fate worse than death, for all of eternity. So, you could argue there is a reason for why they do what they do. It's for saving their people, it's about preservation. Well, the problem with that is they do have alternatives readily present to them, that being the Craftworld lifestyle and the life of the Exodites, both of which are willing to take Drukhari if they decide to leave their old ways behind. I can't imagine that's an easy transition, but you're not alone when you make it. So it can be done, and has been done. So even though it's maybe not easy, it's still readily doable. Yet they continue on their dark path despite there being alternatives. That is a clear indicator of evil. Even more so than other groups, such as say the Demons of Chaos, simply because the Demons of Chaos, yes, they're evil, but they can't help it. The Drukhari, on the other hand, not only have other options, but it literally doesn't even come naturally to them. We know from the new Lilith Hesperak's book by Mike Brooks that young Drukhari children will cry and wail at the sight of things like torture and gladiatorial games, but their parents will bring them to these events over and over again in order to deliberately desensitize them to torture and murder and slavery and so on. It's ironic, I saw someone say on Twitter a while ago that the Drukhari have more of a right to exist than the Imperium of Man, yet I would say their cruelty is the most deliberate and probably the least excusable in all the galaxy. But in reality, that is a large part of the faction's charm. That's what makes them so interesting and unique. They're just so overtly, inexcusably evil. Now, let's dial it back here. I was talking a lot about choice just now. What about those factions that don't have a choice at all, and are normal biological entities as opposed to being literally made of cruelty in the warp? Let's talk about the Tyranids and the Orcs. Now, here's where things get weird, because the Orcs and Tyranids are actually doing things that you could argue are quote-unquote in their nature. You see, many people will think the Tyranids are just trying to survive. They're like a virus. Could you really call a virus evil? Could you call something like cancer evil? We all despise it with all our hearts, and we all agree it needs to go away forever, but it is not capable of morality, and as such it can't be considered evil. The Tyranids are literally like a virus, or like a wild animal that will rip things apart and eat them, like say a shrike or a butcherbird, which will kidnap baby mice and then spear them on thorn bushes to eat them while they're still alive, ripping them apart with its sharp little beak. That thing might seem evil, but it's really not. So the Tyranids can't be considered evil, except for the fact that everyone who has interacted with the Tyranid hive mind knows and will confirm that it is wholly capable of malice. It can hate, it can hold a grudge, and it is supremely intelligent. Dante, leader of the Blood Angels chapter of Space Marines, realized that the Tyranids were deliberately making a run for their home planet of Baal because it was angry at the Blood Angels for stymieing it and fighting it, even though it was not the most optimum thing to do. It was going out of its way to take them on and try and kill them. Furthermore, the Eldari Spirit Seer, who mentally interfaced with the hive mind briefly, also realized that it is not just some dumb animal or like a neurological system. It is supremely intelligent and very, very hateful. it's more like an angry god. So even though the Tyranid hive mind doesn't seem to have any other possible option available to it, it still is clearly evil in some way. And before I move on, let me touch on the Gene Stealer cults. Because individually, a lot of Gene Stealers are not evil. In fact, many of them believe they are freedom fighters, pushing back against a corrupt planetary government or a corrupt system such as the Imperium to better the plight of the people around them. Or they are just going along with what everyone else is going along with because they believe in the Four-Armed Emperor, it's just the way of the planet and the way of the people. Well, we then kind of run into the similar issue as a lot of lower-ranking Chaos cultists, because even though they are not personally evil or have evil in their hearts, they are still on the side of evil, even though they have been duped into it. And again, while ignorance is a mitigating factor, it is no excuse. So while a lot of individual Gene Stealers are not evil people, the organization that is Gene Stealers in general is evil. But what about the Orcs? They also don't have any other option available to them that we've seen. And I don't mean that as in if they're not always fighting, they'll just all explode. It really seems more like they're not mentally capable of processing any other way of being. It's just their entire frame of reference, because as we all know, they were created by the Old Ones, an ancient race that was fighting a war against another race known as the Necrontyr. They created the Orcs in a more refined and powerful state called the Krork, but without the Old Ones over the millions of years, they have devolved into the Orcs, which are effectively a fungus and spread as such, and then pop out of the ground ready to begin a life of fighting, because that is the only reason they have to exist. It is their culture, it is what they enjoy, and they're flatly not capable of processing any other way of being. If humans do things that are not just all about fighting all the time, they view it as weird and nonsensical. They specifically say, whatever man, they're humies, they ain't logical, because humans will broadcast where all their most valuable stuff is, and then be upset when you go and try and take it from them. Also, it's always really funny in video games when orcs interact with Chaos Space Marines, especially World Eaters, because they're like, we're gonna destroy you, we're gonna rip you apart, we're gonna kill you, we're gonna take your skulls for corn, and the orcs are like, well alright, now you're speaking my language, buddy, let's go. It's just really funny, and it kind of shines a light on why it's a little harder to consider the orcs evil. Because, simply put, they lack the mentality for evil, the sort of mens rea, one half of what is needed to be considered guilty of a crime, mens rea and actus reus, this being in comparison to both the Tyranids and the Drukhari, who both take evil actions and have evil mentalities. But I should note, that framework of mens rea and actus reus is not really conducive to answering the question whether or not a fictional faction is evil or not in Warhammer, because the argument here is more philosophical, not really legal. Still though, how then can the orcs be considered evil? Well, it comes from what you could call group consensus. Since actions in Warhammer are measured on a galactic scale, it makes sense that whatever is acceptable on the galactic scale or to the galactic majority would be considered evil. The problem is, though, the orcs do make up a very big portion of the galaxy and are considered to be the most numerous race in the Milky Way. So yeah, they actually have a very big say in what is considered evil or not, and as such, it's very hard to rule against them in terms of galactic consensus. But since they don't have a framework for what is right and wrong, they can't really be considered in that jurisdiction of deciding the galactic consensus. They're more like a force of nature than they are a sentient species. For example, if you stumble across a field full of dandelions, you won't call it a field of dandelions or a dandelion field. You'll call it a field infested with dandelions because they are a weed. We do not view them as a proper part of the plant life of a region because of their weed status. And yes, weed race is a term used in Warhammer. However, we don't consider weeds evil either, even though we don't consider them on par with other plants. For example, if dandelions start taking over your garden and sucking all the nutrients away from your flowers that you worked so hard to plant, they don't have like a shard of the soul of Genghis Khan in each one, and they're not conquering your lawn like the steppes. They just are. And as such, I actually don't think you can consider orcs evil. I was effectively misdirecting you. However, that does not make them good guys, just because they're not evil. They are again more like a force of nature, or something largely neutral, a distinction that does again not apply to the Tyranids because of their capacity for malice. Next on the list is the Necrons, and the Necrons are, generally speaking, one of the more evil factions in Warhammer because they don't really have any justification for the way they are. Simply put, most of them, the ones that can make decisions at least, generally speaking, want to enslave or wipe out all life in the galaxy so that they alone can lead and rule. They want for nothing given their metal bodies, and are fully capable of other ways of life, pursuing the arts, negotiating deals with other factions, and so on and so on. Something that has actually proven advantageous in many instances against the Tyranids when they've allied with the Imperium of Man. Furthermore, Necrons tend to be some of the most eminently intelligent and eloquent beings in the entire galaxy, with any Necron of status being able to match wits with even the best of humanity very easily. And yet, despite all of that, they choose the path of destruction and domination. So what have we established here? That there are absolutely races and groups in the galaxy that are objectively evil, that good is not defined by just the absence of cruelty or malice, and that even if you have no other possible choice or way of being available to you, or if you just don't know what you're doing is wrong, then yes, you still can be considered evil, or part of a group that is evil, even if you personally do not hold evil in your heart. Now, let's start getting into the tough ones, that being the Imperium of Man, the Eldari, the Leagues of Votann, and the Tau. What's interesting first and foremost is the fact that a lot of people who argue that the Imperium is evil will take the route that the Eldari are in fact good. But are they really? What good do the Eldari, specifically the Asuryani in this instance, really do? They live on their craft worlds, they try to keep themselves alive and try to keep their race going. But that isn't really conducive to being good in my mind. There's nothing inherently good about survival. It's just a basic response. Everything tries to survive, from the lowest bacteria to the highest life forms in the galaxy. That's like saying eating makes you a good person. It doesn't. What does make you a good person is making sure other people have food when they're having food doesn't really benefit you in any particular way, or you don't have to go out of your way to do so. Furthermore, if you get somebody food simply because you want them in your debt, or because you're going to need them for something, that isn't very good, even if it might seem good to the person you just gave food to. Your intentions are not really good. That's why the Eldari are really hard to consider as good. What good do they really do? Do they do anything particularly moral? Do they do anything virtuous? No, all the good they do, say their self-restraint or their stoicism and abstinence, is only really good because it saves their lives. They do it so that they can stay alive, not because they believe it's virtuous. And generally speaking, they make no effort to help lower life forms as they view them. And it's also kind of funny because when you think about it, the Eldari are way more racist than the Imperium, because the Imperium's hatred of Xenos is, you can't be trusted, we don't want you near us because you'll try to get us, so we have to get you first. Basically a sort of survival by destruction of the enemy. It's pretty simple, I don't understand you and I don't trust you. But with the Eldari, it's, you are literally below me as a life form. You are a monkey. You are subhuman. You are an animal. You are a barbarian. You are dirty. You are disgusting. Your language makes me sick to hear. Eldari are way more racist than any Space Marine. People joke about how if there is casual racism, that implies the existence of competitive racism. And if Space Marines are competitive racism, the Eldari are like playoffs Eastern Conference racism. That being said though, I think it is safe to say that the Eldari are very self-interested as a race, and Gilliman even comments, yes, we are working with the Eldari now, but make no mistake, they would throw our entire species under the bus if it meant they could save themselves. Even Eldari themselves are very open about the fact that they would absolutely let a lot of humans die to save a few of their own. And anytime they work with the Imperium, it's usually because they want the Imperium as muscle to deal with a larger threat that they both share. And the only reason they care about the fact that they both share the threat is because they can use that fact to leverage the Imperium to, again, be the muscle and the spare blood. There is nothing particularly good about the Eldari as a race. And from what little we know about the Leagues of Votann, they fall into a similar beat. Yes, they will have trading relations with other races, but that's because they use that to enrich themselves. Furthermore, they're also, again, known to be pretty obsessed with just mining and making money as best they can. You know, they're dwarves. So again, even though there is seemingly nothing good about the Votann, I think they are actually one of the least bad races in the entire galaxy. So that's a pretty interesting distinction for them to hold. However, I do make that distinction with a fair bit of trepidation because we just don't have a lot about the Leagues of Votann. We're very in the dark about a lot of their goings-on. However, in their one novel, The High Call's Oath, we see that their relations with the Imperium, while not amazing, are at the very least decent, and they are willing to cooperate. So, it's probably one of the most warm relationships we see in the entire galaxy between two different groups, because the Imperium does view the Votann as essentially Xenos, and the Votann are very careful to keep their identity as a human offshoot secret from the Imperium and especially the Adeptus Mechanicus. And it's not just the Imperium, because another group of Votann, that being a militarized expedition fleet called a Prospect, known as the Demiurge, are very openly allied with the Tau and get along with them quite well. So yes, I would say the Leagues of Votann are probably the least bad out of every faction in Warhammer. But again, they're not really particularly good in any meaningful sense. And there's also the fact that their region of space is quite isolated, and as such they deal with a lot less than the Imperium of Man. And there's also the fact that they don't have many psychers, or at the very least are not very psychically active as a baseline. Their psychers are very specific people in very small numbers, and that will become important later. And that distinction comes into play a lot more when we talk about the Tau. Because on the surface, you would think, yeah, the Tau are good. They're probably the most tolerant species in the galaxy, they provide technology to the races they assimilate, and they extend the olive branch long before they start expending ammunition. And yes, they have had some hiccups, like when they attacked Craftworld Eldari, thinking they were Drukhari, because the Drukhari had basically just screwed them over hard, see the War of Dark Revelations. They were quick to stop fighting and extend an alliance offer, which was rejected. Another big issue with the Tau, however, is also the fact that they have their caste system, which, maybe not as cruel as some caste systems as we know them that have existed in the real world, is still never really a good thing, especially given the fact that it's also tied to a form of eugenics that the Tau practice. But generally speaking, yeah, the Tau I guess are good guys. But there's a problem. They haven't really had much opportunity to be bad. Now, it should be noted they certainly have had opportunities. They could have come out of the gate swinging genocidally the second they started expanding, but that wouldn't have really been practical. So when compared to the Imperium, they look like good guys. But they are not the Imperium of Man. And you might think, yeah, obviously, but when you think about it, it really does make a huge difference. Because the Tau have not gone through even a quarter of a fraction of the things the Imperium of Man has gone through, or humanity as a whole. Let me put it this way. Imagine saying to someone who's in like the 10th grade, you're a good person. Yeah, that's nice, and hey, good for them. A lot of people at that age do suck, but the teenager you're saying this to has both their parents and grew up in an affluent home in a suburban neighborhood and went to at least a, let's call it a cheap private school. It's pretty good, and simply put, them being a good person isn't that shocking, because they haven't really had to deal with a lot of the factors that tend to create rougher, more bad people. So telling that person, you're a good kid, is not nearly the same as looking at someone well into their 50s, who grew up in poverty, has been to war, has seen untold horrors, and still has come through on the other side, not intact but at least functional, and saying to that person, you're a good man. And I think that's actually something people tend to forget. A lot of what makes being a good person meaningful is the circumstances surrounding someone, what they had to overcome, what they had to go through. You see, the Tau and the Votann both grew up in air quotes, in very isolated areas where they did not have to deal with many external Xenos threats. Meanwhile, the planets that would make up the Imperium had to deal with constant raids from Xenos during Old Night, and many of the worlds had to be liberated from alien influence, be it Drukhari raiding, or direct Xenos overlordship, such as with the Overseers on Mortarian's home planet of Barbarous, yes, they are confirmed to be Xenos, and the Nephilim who used mass mind control on humans, and would use them as cannon fodder. And while yes, it's very easy for everyone else to look and say, hey, wiping out alien races left, right, and center and being completely hostile to aliens on sight is bad, it is literally stated in the book Sanguinius the Great Angel that the vast bulk of humanity was in favor of this very xenocidal and xenophobic doctrine and ethos because they knew how much humanity had suffered under the boot of Xenos during Old Night. So for them, it seemed necessary. Let me put forward an example. If you steal a loaf of bread, you're probably a bad person. That's not something good people generally do. However, people in very desperate circumstances can be forgiven for doing so, and even can be seen as good people for doing so, because they're either trying to support others, or at least finding a less harmful criminal way to support themselves in a time of extreme need, as opposed to, say, armed robbery. Like, yeah, it is objectively bad, but the circumstances do matter when considering the character of the person doing such an act. Another example, I think, would be one that compares the very brutal nature of someone's surroundings and how that influences their actions. For example, we can all agree it's bad to throw the first punch. Someone says something you don't like, so you punch them in the face. That's generally speaking bad. But if you're in, say, prison, and someone says something you don't like, but you don't do anything, suddenly things could get very bad for you as you become known as someone people can work over and take advantage of. So while breaking somebody's nose for being a loudmouth on the outside is bad, it's what you had to do to keep yourself safe, and quite possibly keep other people safe who associate with you, because if they're known to associate with someone who is weak, that puts a target on them as well. So, given the circumstances, there are different rules of engagement, and as such, different parameters regarding what is maybe not good, but at the very least acceptable. And yes, there are some things that are wholeheartedly unforgivable in our world, but when looking at fictional settings and factions, it becomes more complicated because obviously it's not real, and as such, there can be more nuance and a little more forgiveness and leash. Kind of like how you can have characters that have wiped out entire, cities of people, yet still join the main cast as a quote-unquote good guy, such as, say, Vegeta and Piccolo from Dragon Ball. Furthermore, the Imperium of Man has to deal with a population that is both extremely large and comparatively very psi-active, especially when looking at the Tau and Votann, who generally speaking are very psychically blunt. The Votann do have a few psychers kicking around, sure, but the vast majority of them are damn near psychically inert. And the reason this matters is because psychically active individuals can be a huge liability when it comes to demons of the warp. They can serve as inadvertent conduits, or become corrupted by their own power, or a large group of psychically active people can effectively affect the world around them, something the Tau Empire is finding out the hard way as the presence of the goddess of the greater good, as spawned in by the generally psychically active humans that have come into the Tau Empire, has become nearly impossible to deny the existence of. And as such, the Tau are trying to figure out what to do about this. This goddess, known as Tauva, now has a fully formed religion surrounding her. It's a nascent religion, sure, but it is getting there. And that is a problem because the Tau are strictly atheistic in how they approach things. Sure, they allow you to be religious and follow your own religion, as long as it doesn't interfere with their wider atheistic vision for their society and their empire. But this can't be denied. It's starting to have more and more effect on how things are run, with even some honest-to-God Tau starting to worship this goddess of the Tauva, despite the fact that they themselves are psychically inert, such as the commander Shadow Sun. With Farsight out of the picture, Shadow Sun is arguably one of the best commanders the Tau has, aside from a man named Sure Strike. The thing about Sure Strike, though, is that he led the Fourth Sphere of Expansion, which encountered first the Tau goddess, and he made the decision to start wiping out the Tau allied humans and psychically active auxiliaries, both in his sphere of expansion and within the Tau Empire wherever he could find them. This was their first act of internecine genocide. And while he was arrested, he seems to have been largely cleared of charges, and while certainly not in good standing, is still being kept around by the Ethereals. And if the truth about Shadow Sun's new faith in the goddess Tauva becomes known, there is a very real chance that the Ethereals will have to rely on him as someone who can keep their base of power intact in the face of this new pressure. Because the good Tau, who grew up as good suburban kids and went to a private school, are now suddenly about to be exposed to a very, very harsh world. Because here's the thing. You see, humans breed very quickly in Warhammer and cluster together in enormous quantities in their hive cities. And as the Tau take more and more of these worlds, the human population is spiking rapidly. And the penchant for deification and worship and a religious tendency is confirmed to be a canon part of the human characteristic, baseline humans at least, in Warhammer. So, it is very likely this faith in Tauva will continue to spread. And given how much humans tend to spread and breed, there is a very real possibility the Tau will find themselves, at the very least, slightly outnumbered in their own empire by the humans. Humans who may suddenly start to think, actually, the Tauva is a goddess, and we worship her, and maybe we should be the ones in charge because maybe she's chosen us. Maybe you are a heretic. Except in this instance, the term would be infidel as opposed to heretic, and instead of a crusade against the heretics, this would be a jihad against the infidels, waged within the Tau Empire to try and seize control of it by this new, very powerful faction. A faction of humans who, mind you, tend to always flock towards the Fire Warrior caste. So the humans in the Tau Empire are generally speaking pretty well armed, and while they might not have the battle suits that the rest of the Tau have, because they're just not allowed to pilot them, their zeal would absolutely help make up the difference. So all of a sudden, that good kid is now in the prison yard, and as such, he needs to find a way to protect himself. But he says, no, I don't want to. They called me a good kid back in school because I never played with knives, I never made anything dangerous and never got into fights. Well now, the more at least acceptable thing to do is make a shiv to protect yourself with, because there are no rules in this hellhole. And you can do more good by keeping yourself at the very least alive, even if it means breaking some rules, because that means you can talk to some people on the inside, maybe help some people learn to read, help encourage some people to get their GED, that sort of thing. But in order to last long enough to get to that point, you had to gouge out someone's eye with a sharpened pencil. Are you still really the same good person you used to be back in the day? Not everyone would agree. Going back to the Tau, what happens if, say, they get to a point where this sort of internal jihad has either kicked off or can be seen on the horizon? So the Tau have had to hand over more and more military power to dangerous and ruthless leaders like Surestrike. What happens then? Does the Tau Empire start turning into a vicious police state? Do they start instituting mass surveillance? Does anyone breathing the word of Tauva the goddess suddenly disappear? Do entire communities get sterilized or liquidated, something that the Inquisition has been criticized for time and time again very rightly, in order to make an example when the suppression of information proves to not be enough? And all of this is being done to both maintain the power of the Ethereals, the social structure that has gotten the Tau Empire this far, and to stop the Empire from sliding into the arguably insane zealotry that they see in the Imperium from afar. At that point, what choice do they have? You have to understand the circumstances they're in. They're still good, right? Suddenly, it's not all that clear. And in fact, the cracks are already starting to show, not just with Surestrike, but also the fact that the Tau have fired on unarmed transports of refugees headed towards the Farsight enclaves, because they cannot let that rebellious ideology spread, given that it is a threat to the established order. We can say the Tau are good, sure, but that's because by comparison to the Imperium, with its millennia of war against chaos, its conflicts with Xenos that were brought about initially by very understandable reasons, yet steadily spiraled out of control, its terrifyingly high amount of psychers that's only increasing, its very, very many mouths to feed, and its need to keep the Empire together lest all the planets be picked off one by one, sliding humanity back towards the trajectory of extinction it was on before the Emperor came along and ended Old Night. They have had almost no chance to truly be not good, and now they're sliding into it. I think a lot of people don't realize, and it's something I've kind of realized while making this video, how much a lot of people don't realize being a good person is based off trajectory and momentum. The weight of circumstances, the factors pressing upon you and putting you in situations and giving you opportunities to fail and stumble and fall really does play a very large hand in what makes someone a good person in the eyes of others, but perhaps not in regard to their own situation, which is oftentimes a lot more complicated than people will realize on the outside. Which is honestly why it's hard to say the Imperium is bad. Despite everything that is well and truly horrifying about it, it is genuinely hard to call the Imperium bad. I mean, I would certainly never want to live there. Someone who grew up in the Tau Empire would never want to live there, but that's also because I would never want to go to prison, and someone who grew up in that wealthy suburb would never ever want to set foot in prison. But some people find themselves there, and sometimes that can happen because of momentum, the weight of circumstance dragging them down a less than favorable path. And once you are in that situation, there are things you have to do that are good in your subjective circumstance, but are generally speaking seen as not good. That is what the Imperium is. It is that grizzled person in their 50s, who is in prison, who has been to war, who has seen it all and somehow managed to survive, and yet is still not the worst person you know. Is still someone who, in a pinch, you would trust with your child if you really had to. And that actually says a lot. Hell, even things like servitors, something people often point to as a great evil of the Imperium, proof that it's bad, are a necessity because of the cybernetic revolt. Humanity can't rely on computers to any meaningful degree simply because they did once before and it had catastrophic results. So even the usage of servitors is a necessity. It is bad, yes, but again, the weight of circumstance and momentum presents it as the best option. Even then, they're still fairly humane about it. A lot of servitors we read about are generally speaking bad people, some of them even being rapists. Furthermore, a lot of them are actually vat-grown and were never even people at all. The best explanation, though, of this, about why the Imperium is not bad, even if it's not wholly good, comes from not any novel, but rather an audio drama called The Interrogation of Salvor Lermontov, where an inquisitor named Erasmus Crowell, someone who is a very dedicated person who's willing to do what it takes, who absolutely personifies that old grizzled prisoner veteran I've been harping on about, talks to someone who was leading a rebellion on Terra against the rule of the High Lords amongst the lower classes. Now, this person actually fought alongside Crowell's forces to help stop a Drukhari homunculus and his creations on Terra, which was posing a very real threat to the throne. And yet, Crowell still drags him in for interrogation nonetheless. And Lermontov goes on about how he fought the enemies of the Imperium everywhere, and he saw so much. He learned to fight in his name and love fighting in his name. However, he saw Terra. He went there on a pilgrimage, and it appalled him, it disgusted him, and he eventually comes to the conclusion that he states plainly, "You can love the Emperor, but hate his servants. I am no traitor to the throne, but to the Imperium, maybe. To the fat lords who preside over our suffering, maybe. The world looks different when you are starving." And Crowell responds back with the tin can answers, "Sin against the least of his adepts, and you sin against him," but Lermontov calls him on it every step of the way, basically saying, "I know damn well you don't believe that because I can sense honor in you." And eventually, Crowell caves and gives him the truth and says this, "Here's the truth. You know nothing of blindness, nor of sight. You see the physical world around you and think that is all there is to see. How could you think otherwise? That was the way we trained you. If you had ever reached beyond that training, one of us would have come for you sooner. But there is more, much more out there. There is a horror you cannot even begin to imagine, and it thirsts for every soul in this world and every soul on every other world, and it will not rest until it devours them all. There are powers dwelling beyond the void. They witness every demagogue like you, every rebel rouser with fire in their soul and clarity in his heart, and they laugh. For they know, as I know, that if this rotten carcass of an Imperium is brought down by you or me or by anyone else, then there is nothing else left. Nothing left but the horror. You think we're winning this war? If you knew even for a second what losing meant, you could not stand the terror of it." And eventually he does execute Lermontov with a bolt shot to the chest, and says, "Everything you said has been true, but so has everything I said." The Imperium is so entrenched in its own darkness and inefficiencies and sufferings that it's impossible to unwind a lot of the systems that keep those things in place without effectively bringing down the whole Imperium. A corrupt governor who lets his people go to sleep hungry to line his own pockets is far less of a problem than one who, say, drags his entire planet into rebellion because the Imperium is trying to take away his prestigious position, and as such, opens the world to the influence of chaos cults, thereby leading to an exterminatus, or leading to an entire system or even subsector-wide war. You might need to treat a gaping wound in your leg with stitches, but you can't do that if you're also on the run, so it's best to just keep taking pain pills and wrapping it with whatever newspaper you come across. Normally that would be a stupid thing to do, but you are not in a rational situation. and as such, can you really be considered an idiot? And you could say much the same about, say, the perfidiousness of the Eldari. Yeah, make no mistake, a lot of the things they do and a lot of the lies they tell can seem teeth-grindingly infuriating and really, really bad, but when you start considering the wider implications and their wider concern for keeping their species alive, it suddenly doesn't seem that bad. It's good because it's the least bad thing you could do in that situation. So in that case, what is good? Is there anything good in this galaxy at all? Yes, actually there is. And it's people. There are no good factions in Warhammer, only good people. And the form those people can take can vary wildly. I just mentioned the Inquisitor Erasmus Crowell as a good person, given the circumstances he's in. And shockingly, a fair few amount of Inquisitors are, even considering some of the wildly difficult situations they find themselves in. See Gregor Eisenhorn. And Guilliman is effectively a military dictator who is putting legions of people to the death at any one time, and who acknowledges that he doesn't even love his own sons all that much. And yet, he is a good person because of what he does for other people. But that's kind of cheating. He's a Primarch. So I want to talk about a few examples of people who are good given their circumstances and don't have the benefit of being, say, a Primarch. Let's talk about Merrick Grimaldus. Moving past the large sweeping considerations of entire factions and focusing on the personal minutiae, Merrick Grimaldus, Reclusiarch and High Chaplain of the Black Templars, is a good person. But why? What makes him a good person? Well, I want to explain it in the context of his actions compared to another character who is also a good person from a setting that is completely different from Warhammer, and using that juxtaposition to illustrate why he is good. The other day, I posted a picture of this character to my YouTube community tab, saying, you guys are gonna learn what Grimaldus and this character have in common. Well, here she is. Her name is Amy, and she is from a webtoon called Spaceboy. And full disclosure, a friend of mine told me about this comic and has been telling me about it for a while, and I finally gave it a read. It's been going for about 10 years and has around 370 chapters. And I plowed through it in about 6 days. It was that good. It's legitimately one of the most engaging pieces of media I've ever read. And me being me, I started making Warhammer comparisons. And here's the thing about this girl Amy. She is a good person, because what she does is helps other people. But her scenario is very different than, say, Grimaldus. She doesn't help other people by blasting others in the face with a plasma gun. What she does is give them hope. She goes out of her way to help other people with their problems, bolster their spirits, and tell them that everything is going to be okay. She actually has what is essentially synesthesia, where she can sense the flavor of those around her. And when she senses that something is wrong with the flavor, she will go out of her way to try and help you fix it. There are instances where she has no reason to do this, but she resolves to anyway. There are times when she knowingly puts herself in essentially danger of getting in trouble or even being killed in order to help other people, even to the detriment of her own mental health. She goes out of her way to help others and give them hope. And this is exactly the kind of thing that makes her a good person. And that is what Grimaldus does. He goes out of his way to bring hope to others, even when he maybe doesn't have to. He has essentially resolved himself to die in the defense of Hell's Reach, saying, I will die on this world, I will die on Armageddon, viewing the job of defending the city as essentially a lame task that he's just kind of been backbenched to. He's not happy about it, but he continually tries to reach out to people to bolster their spirits. He convinces the Legio Titanicus in the region to stay and fight for the city. He convinces the Crone, who is in charge of the Imperator Titan, to not merge with the machine spirit but hang on a little longer to fight until the end. He also talks to the guardsmen, the stormtroopers like Andrei, and connects with them, thereby bolstering their spirits. He makes these grand speeches to others, saying, I've dug my grave here, and I'm either going to succeed or die in the last stand, in order to, again, bolster their spirits. He does this continuously, because he's a good person. And you could argue, well, he's just doing that because he has to, it's his duty to defend the city. But there are instances when he goes out of his way. For example, when he finds out that the honorable Space Marine chapter called the Celestial Lions are being unfairly targeted by the Inquisition, specifically because they spoke out against the Inquisition's unfair policy towards civilians, Grimaldus goes out of his way to try and convince the surviving handful of Celestial Lions to not just throw away their lives honorably, but rather live on, so that their chapter can survive and they can continue to do good. But when it becomes clear that he can't persuade them to leave the planet, he resolves to fight alongside the last surviving Celestial Lion in order to help him stay alive. And he actually succeeds in this, despite putting himself at immense personal risk in service to someone who literally wants to die, essentially saying to him, if you're gonna do something crazy, I won't let you do it alone. I won't quit on you, even if you want me to. That is the mark of a good person. And it's the exact kind of thing Amy from Spaceboy does. Because there is another character, the other protagonist of the story, a boy named Oliver. And I don't want to spoil what's going on with Oliver because by God, you should read this blind. But I will say that the thing with Oliver, at least initially, is that he gives himself over to something called the nothingness, where he enters this state of not feeling, not emoting, not connecting with others, shutting himself off from the entire world, almost dissociating as a means to protect himself and protect those around him, because it's what he has to do, given both his trauma and the horrifying circumstances he finds himself in. However, Amy is the first person to actually reach out and connect to him, and he's finally happy. But he eventually tells her, I'm sorry we can't hang out anymore because you're not safe around me. However, she doesn't quit and literally yells at him as he ignores her that she's going to help him fight the nothing. That is absolutely the mark of a good person. When someone tells you, my fate is sealed, just forget about me, but you look them in the face and say, no, I'm gonna find a way to help you, whether you want me to or not, I will not leave you behind. So if we can agree that Amy from Spaceboy is a good person, then so too is Grimaldus. And furthermore, Amy gives people hope. She goes out of her way to listen to others and keep the spirits of others afloat, but she does so by listening to them and hearing them out, even though it causes her to have a lot of burnout and eventually panic attacks. Grimaldus actually does something similar. He gives people hope, but his way of doing so is different, because his circumstances are very different. For example, when in a conference room, one lieutenant says, we can't hold the city anymore, there's too many orcs, they're gonna overrun Hell's Reach, we need to retreat, we've done all we can, Grimaldus steps in. Because this lieutenant is killing the hope of other people. By voicing this doubt, he is hurting everyone's morale. So Grimaldus steps in, grabs him by the throat, looks him in the face, calls him a worthless coward who doesn't deserve to be alive, and then snaps his neck. And as such, basically brute forces hope into everyone around him, by showing that 1. Failure and cowardice will not be tolerated. You have no choice but to have hope. And by showing that if you have people who are so strong and brutal like me on your side, you have a chance at winning, so you still should have hope. He brings hope to people. He convinces them to keep going just a little longer when otherwise they were on the verge of quitting. But his methods for doing so are very, very different. However, that's because, again, his circumstances are wildly different than Amy's. But they still both manage to be the same person, someone who brings hope to others. This is, in my mind, the driving truth behind 40k. There are no good factions, only good people. What I'm trying to illustrate here is how part of why there are so few good people in 40k is because so much of what everyone does all the time is out of necessity and obligation. Grimaldus, however, does a lot of these things out of a sense of morality, out of a sense that it's what he should be doing, and a sense of what is right and wrong in the world, not right and wrong in context of what his job is. And I feel like with Space Marines and 40k characters in general, we and they themselves lose sight of the distinction between duty and desire. Another example being a character I talk about a lot, a Primaris Marine by the name of Justinian Paris, who is added to the Nova Marines and finds himself clashing with them a lot given the way they treat civilians versus how he thinks they should be treated. Furthermore, I also noticed Grimaldus doubts himself in much the same way Amy does. He's very young for his position, and he doesn't know if he can fill his mentor Mordred's shoes. And Amy ends up thrust into situations, but doesn't really view herself as strong enough to deal with them. In both such cases, we as the audience know they are wrong about themselves. They also undertake the kindness they give others as though it is a duty, even though we can see that they're actually going above and beyond and out of their way, with Grimaldus even referring to himself as a weapon. Meanwhile, Amy, with her power to basically sense people's aura through taste — she does not lick people, by the way, don't get that impression — takes it on herself to start helping people with their problems, since she can literally gauge how they're feeling and when they are lying, effectively assigning it onto herself as her literal job, even though that is actually very harmful for her because she's taking on a lot of burden. Interestingly, those around them can actually seem to pick up on their internal goodness more than them, with everyone Amy meets immediately viewing her as a friend and being willing to go out of their way to help her in turn. And Grimaldus being told that he has quote-unquote kind eyes by Princeps Majoris Zahara Mankion, the Imperator-class Titan pilot. This is the core of his being. He's not just, quote, doing his job, and that's something both he and Amy come to realize as time goes on. Amy realizes that she is taking on too much burden and not letting others help her carry the weight she puts on herself, while Grimaldus comes to realize that what he's doing is not just his job, but that he actually is doing it for the people of Hive Hellsreach. This is something you will see in good person types of characters because they are often very humble and they don't really realize how good they are as people. And since being a good person is something that most people aspire to anyway, it seems like they're often at the end of their character arc, but in reality, their character arc often revolves around letting others in and coming to better understand themselves. Amy comes to realize that she is starting to run herself ragged by trying to help everyone around her. Meanwhile, Grimaldus goes through a similar process, where he realizes that he doesn't have to fill the shoes of his predecessor Mordred and can just be himself. For example, when he gives the relics of the people of Hellsreach back to them after being the only survivor of the chapel fight, he has a brief conversation with his High Marshal Helbrecht, where he says, "When I return to the surface, I will offer the icons back to the people." Mordred would not have done so, Helbrecht said, masking any emotion, any judgment from me. "I am not Mordred," I told my liege, "and the people deserve the choice. It is for them that we waged that war. For them and their world, not purely for the holy reaping of inhuman life. And I wonder now, as they chant my new title, what they will decide to do with the relics. Hero of Hellsreach," the crowd cheers, as if there's only one. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding around that line. There's almost a sort of Mandela effect, where everyone seems to remember it as if there was only one. But in both the novel and the animated film on YouTube, it is "there is only one." When you say "there was only one," it makes it sound like he's saying that in remembrance of all those who sacrificed their lives. But when he says "is only one," it sounds more like he's saying that in acknowledgement to himself of all the people who stood with him in the defense of Hellsreach, be they alive or dead. And he says this right after talking about the people of the world and how this war was waged for them. That kind of acknowledging of human worth is something that a lot of Space Marines, even ones from the nicest and most human of chapters, tend to struggle with at times. And it's not like that's a change in him that occurred over the course of this book. Instead, it's just something he's now more cognizant of inside himself. This is because he is a good person. And it's not just Grimaldus. It's also Inquisitor Crowl, as I said. It's also Commander Farsight, who saw that something was wrong with what the Ethereals were doing and went out of his way, sacrificing his prestigious position as one of the greatest heroes the Tau have ever known, in order to break away from them and try something different. And he even goes out of his way to spare enemy medics when he realizes that what they're doing is important. He just has a conversation with a Space Marine apothecary who's extracting gene seed and lets him live and do what he's doing. He had no reason to do that. Another example of a good person would be arguably Eldrad Ulthran, who has time and again risked ostracization by the rest of the Eldari because he's willing to be unconventional and try new things, and is oftentimes more willing to work with humans and hear them out than the rest of his race. Even Trazyn the Infinite, while certainly complicated and very self-interested, is probably a lot closer to being a good person than many of the other people in the galaxy, and especially in the Necron race. Which is actually funny because in many other settings he would be considered a form of villain. But what do you guys think? Do you guys agree with my assertion that there are no good factions, and even the ones that appear good just haven't really had the chance to be bad yet, and in fact there are only good people? What are some other objectively good people that you see in Warhammer who would probably not be seen as good in other settings, but are good because they share good characteristics? Do you maybe have an entirely different perspective? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. Please subscribe if you have not already done so. Consider checking out the sponsor of today's video, Manta Sleep, or supporting me on Patreon if you can. And until then, I will see you in the next video.